I'm not scared of the FDA, but I'm scared to death of value analysis committees. That's a pretty powerful statement right there. And while it was only one of our former clients who stated it exactly like that, many of our clients have expressed something really similar. The FDA process I understand, the VAC process I just don't. The reason for this fear that our clients have of VACs is that hospital value analysis committees wield so much power. If the VAC says yes, then you're in. If it says no, then you're out, at least for the time being, until you can come back with better information. But your sale truly is in the VAC. So who am I? My name's Beth Brooks, and I'm the EVP of Global Commercialization for TTI Health Research and Economics. That probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you, so I'm not going to dwell on the title or on the company. What will mean something, at least I hope it'll mean something, is that I've been working as a health economist and market access specialist to the medical device industry for the better part of 2 decades. I'd rather not think about how old that makes me, but that's a fact. I've been there, done that, with just about every type of technology that is sold into hospitals, from disposable supplies used in general surgeries to highly specialized pieces of capital equipment used to diagnose and treat specific cancer indications. So truly, been there, done that, have experience with something similar to your technology. I feel very, very sure. And I'm here to share that experience with you too, to hopefully take some of that fear out of the value analysis committee process. So how are we going to do that? First, we're going to really set the stage and talk about some myths versus realities of VACs and the VAC process. And after we've cleared some of the myths, it's going to be just the facts on the VACs. What are they? Who sits on them? What's their primary function? Then we're going to learn some other important stuff, like what are the biggest mistakes we could make when presenting products to VACs? And now that you know what not to do, we'll give you some examples of what you should do. And we'll let you know what some of our clients have said about the ways we've helped them through the value analysis committee process. And then finally, we'll hit some key takeaways, and then I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have in whatever time we have remaining. So first, let's set the stage. And I'm just going to let you watch this slide for a second before I start talking about it. So did you see what happened? You see the payers, the providers, and the producers. And the money flowed in from the left, from the payer side, and the innovation flowed in from the right, from the producer side. And where did the collision happen? The money and the innovation collided right at the provider level. So first of all, let's talk a little bit more about who the players are in this. The payers are the financiers or the insurers or the payers. Medical, dental, insurance, government, employers, individuals. The providers are obviously the facilities, the physicians, the pharmacies. And who are the producers? Well, the distributors and the suppliers. And again, what's happening? Who's providing all the tension in this system? Again, the medical device manufacturers on the right-hand side are producing innovation, and the payers are telling what they're going to pay and how much they're going to pay for different services. And that money and that innovation collides right at the provider level. So that tells us why they're in the situation that they're in and why they need to use value analysis committees. And while today we're focusing really on the hospital level, on the providers, the same tenets would apply to a physician office sale. So with that as our backdrop, it makes sense, doesn't it? Why you have to demonstrate value to the providers who are at that collision point. How can they best spend the money they're receiving for caring for their patients? It's really all about demonstrating the value of the technology in terms of patient outcomes and in terms of economic impact of the technology and the outcomes it produces. So if you take a look at this picture, you can see safety and efficacy are enough to get you regulatory approval, but you really have to know your clinical value and your economic value in addition to that in order to have market access. So let's talk myth versus reality when it comes to VACs. Because let's face it, there's really a lot of mythology out there about VACs. So first, myth or reality, the VAC is not your customer. So what do you think about that one? Well, I'd say that's really a myth. You might like for the physician to be your customer, but the VAC is your real customer since it's the VAC that's comprised of physicians plus some other folks who are going to determine whether or not your technology will be used. So whether you like the idea or not, they're your customer, and you got to listen to your customer. So next, your product needs a clinical champion. Is that a reality or is that a myth? That one is an absolute reality. The physician isn't your customer, which means that he or she isn't the final decision maker. But if you don't have a physician or physicians championing your technology through the VAC, you're not going to get through it. So what about cost as the primary consideration? Is that reality or is that myth? What do you think about that one? That one sort of seems like a trick question, really. Well, it is reality. So cost is the primary consideration. It's not the only consideration, but it is the primary consideration from the VAC perspective. And it's not just cost of the supply or the capital equipment. It's cost in a broader context that we'll talk about a little bit more. How about this one? VACs are bad for innovation. I know a lot of our clients think that the VACs are bad for innovation, but that's really not true. It might seem that way sometimes when you're trying to get through that process, but they're also charged with other things. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more. They're charged with evaluating older products that are high cost contributors or high use items within a hospital. And sometimes those evaluations can pave the way for the new technologies. The hospitals really are just trying to figure out the best way to spend their money. So how about this one? VACs consider cost effectiveness information. Is that reality or myth? So again, a little bit of a trick question. Is cost effectiveness their primary consideration? No, it's really more of a budgetary impact perspective. But do they care how much they're spending to save an additional life, as an example? Well, yeah. And if you lay it out for them, can they sometimes use your value proposition to obtain additional money and a carve out from payers? Yeah, they can do that too, and you can help them to do that. So they do consider cost effectiveness when it's appropriate. So what about this one? We can't present our data directly to the VAC. Is that a reality or a myth? That one is actually a reality. You can't walk into the VAC meeting directly, but there are things you can do to arm others with the information they need. And finally, is it true that VACs care only about short-term costs? Is that a reality or a myth? Well, that's really kind of another trick question. Apparently, I like trick questions. As I'm going through this, I'm thinking, I guess I really do. I was a professor many, many moons ago, and I was often accused of that, and I denied it at the time, but maybe it's true. So they don't only care about short-term costs, but they do care mostly about short-term costs. So now that we've talked about some myths versus realities of VACs, let's present just a few basic facts about VACs. So first of all, what are they? They're really a formal team that's developed to evaluate new technology acquisitions. Primarily, again, we've talked about this a little bit already and we're going to talk about it some more. They do other stuff, but primarily they're evaluating new technology acquisitions. They can also be called lots of different things. They're not always called a value analysis committee. They can be called technology assessment committee, or several other things that are listed there, or even other names. There's some crazy names out there, but they all have the same purpose, and you really will come across the name VAC most frequently. Who comprises a value analysis committee? Well, they're really made up of physicians, they're made up of nurses, purchasing agents, lots of different folks with lots of different perspectives. Sometimes there can be folks from liability, there can be individuals from maintenance or from the janitorial staff, but the really important thing to note is that they're really quite diverse usually, which is very important to understand. You want to understand that you have one VAC, but there's really multiple perspectives. And multiple perspectives means multiple potential objectors and multiple potential champions also. So what do? So again, they're charged with picking products and services to obtain the best outcomes at the lowest possible cost. That's not the easiest thing to do, but that's what they're charged with. They perform evaluations. They establish and monitor product trials. And that's, again, really important to understand, because at a lot of hospitals, they don't give carte blanche approval to a new technology. A VAC might give you a trial, and that's the best you're going to get. And then in that trial, they're going to be performing those evaluations to see how you do. Do you really demonstrate the cost savings that you told them they would? Do you show the patient outcomes benefits that you said you would? And then if you do, if you meet those promises that you provided, or potentially do more or less, but it's still advantageous to them, then okay, then they'll give you broader access. They also review use of high volume or high cost products or procedures. And that's where the opportunity can lie for innovation, is if a hospital has recognized that a certain technology is really being used too much, or it's costing too much, they are looking for a new technology to take its place, or to take its place in some subset of cases. And so that can really be an opportunity for you. And then finally, how can you influence them? How can you influence the VACs? And the bottom line is, you just got to give them what they need. And speaking of giving them what they need, what do they need? Well, here's what they don't need. They don't need you coming in and not understanding who they are and how they make decisions and what types of patients they have. They don't want to hear features and benefits. They don't want to hear about that. They want to hear data, evidence. They don't want to hear, well, Dr. Smith really loves how this technology feels in her hand. They don't care. They need a reason for change, not simply a user preference. And they don't want to feel like you're only engaging clinicians, but not the supply chain, or like you're only engaging the supply chain and not the clinicians. What's in it for everyone at the table? So what do they want to hear? They want evidence, and they want evidence as much as possible of combined clinical and economic value, using data that's of greatest relevance to them, their own facility types, their own patient populations, their own data, their own situations, whenever you can make that happen. So as we go into our case studies of how we've helped our clients successfully influence VACs in the past, I think this quote bears repeating. There are no secrets to success. It's the result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure. So there's no secret sauce here, guys. There's just not. What there is being smart, preparing, doing the work, and learning from your own mistakes, as well as learning from others' missteps, and applying all of that to your current situation. So our first case study is success via knowing what's important. So what's important here? Here's our technology and our indication. Here we had a disposable surgical supply, and it was used in general surgery, so it was used very frequently within the hospital. And what was the situation? So the client was really cannibalizing its own reusable surgical supply technology in order to compete with new disposables. So they knew what they were doing. This happens quite a lot. You have a new technology, you're really going to cannibalize your own to preserve future market share. And so in this case, they're going from reusable to disposables, and they really thought the solution for them was a side-by-side pro forma comparison of reusable versus disposable across this really exhaustive resource list. And I have to tell you, they came to us with this pro forma. It was really, really well done. They had thought about all the direct and indirect cost categories, all of the comparisons that needed to be made. The tool was beautifully put together. It was customizable by the facility. And again, it was really nice. But the problem was it just wasn't working for them, and they didn't understand why. So we really felt that the first step was to conduct research with the facility decision makers to learn what was important when deciding to switch to disposable. Did they really want to see those comparisons? Did they want to just see a subset of those direct cost comparisons? What was important to them when they were making that decision? And what we learned was really, it was kind of surprising. We learned from the pediatric hospital perspective that they were already under pressure to switch to disposables. There's concerns about potential infections from using reusable technologies, and that the switch to disposable was being required in a number of cases. And so the adult side was just proactively saying, well, it's coming in our direction, so we're just going to go ahead and do this. So the switch from the reusable to the disposable was happening. What they were interested in is which disposable to choose, because there were other alternatives. And so what we also learned through this process was that the ability of our clients' technology to participate in recycling program with disposables was huge. And that was a big decision factor for them. Is this product available to participate in recycling versus this one that might not be? That was a very key point that they were interested in. They were also very interested in the way in which the products were labeled and how they would be stored. That was very important to their operation internally. And ultimately, pro forma comparisons, we showed it to them, we talked about it, they really just didn't care. That was not coming into their decision-making process. And so that's really the first thing, is what's important. Do you know what's important, or do you just think you know what's important? It's really crucial that you establish that before you develop your strategy for dealing with the VACs. So case study number 2. Success via the KISS principle. So I'm sure most of you know what I mean by the KISS principle, but we'll talk about it a little bit more here. So the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. So that's really the point that we're making here, is keep it simple whenever possible. And in this example is one in which the solution was just the simplest tool that you can imagine that showed a side-by-side comparison. Here we had a technology that was a small bowel feeding tube. It was used in a critical care setting. Our client's technology, though, was about 3 times more expensive than existing standard feeding tubes. And hospitals were telling them, when they'd go in and talk to them, they just couldn't justify that additional expense. So what we were able to do is to really show that the client's own data showed reduction in other resource use when their tube was used versus the standard feeding tubes. So they didn't have to have radiography there for placement. They were more successful more frequently placing the product, so they didn't use as many feeding tubes. And using the data that they already had, again, we were able to put together this side-by-side comparison, a very, very simple budgetary impact model that showed that the higher cost of that innovative product was easily offset by the reduction in additional medical resource use. And so what was the outcome of that? Well, the client was successful in using that model with hospital purchasers and gaining them as champions through that VAC process. The clinicians already loved it. They needed the hospital purchasers to be on board, and this enabled them to do that. Now, case study 3 is success via an administrative database analysis. And we'll obviously talk through what that means as we go through the case study. So in this case, our client had a surgical supply that was used to prevent specific procedural complications and used during a specific type of surgical procedure. So their challenge was really to convince facilities to invest in this prophylactic technology to prevent rare complications. So why should the facility spend money on every case when they're really just preventing something that occurs very infrequently? And the facilities didn't seem to understand either how frequent or infrequent the complications were or how expensive they were when they did occur. So what we really decided to do is to go in and figure out, okay, how much are they really costing and how frequently are they occurring? And so we designed and executed an administrative database analysis to do exactly that, estimate the rate and the cost of these rare surgical complications. And then once that was accomplished, to prepare peer-reviewed communications, abstracts and posters around that for the client to be able to feed into their own simple budgetary impact model that they had developed. So what happened? Well, we really discovered that yes, those complications were very rare. They occurred approximately 2 to 4% of the time, but when they did occur, they were very, very expensive. And the cost of the technology to prevent those complications was more than justified by the cost of the complications when they did occur. So the client was able to develop their budgetary impact model, have that data feed into it, and utilize those findings to influence the VACs and to expand access for their technology. So another case study, success via both modeling and database analysis. So here we're really looking at diagnostic technologies and multiple indications. So here I'm not thinking about one specific case, but really multiple different examples that we've used with our clients. So diagnostic technologies, multiple indications. And in all cases, our clients have been challenged, as you often are, to convince facilities to utilize their innovative diagnostic due to diagnostic income associated with what's currently used. So let's suppose that a hospital uses a certain method of diagnosing a condition that they've figured out exactly how to do it. They know how to do it well. They know how to bill for it. They know how to get paid for it, and they've got a really great system going on, where they put the patients into that funnel and it's diagnostic revenue for them. So it's something that they're not wanting to change because they don't see the benefit right away of eliminating what they consider to be a cash cow within their hospital. So what we did was to develop models which simulate the impact of more effective diagnosis in moving patients into treatment procedures. So if you can diagnose them more effectively and then move them into treatment more efficiently, more quickly, first of all, you can prevent bad things from happening to the patients and the costs that are associated with those, but you get the treatment revenue then. And so that can offset that lost diagnostic income, improve outcomes, it improves patient care, and it can shift your bottom line. Maybe your money's moving away from the diagnostic revenue, but you're getting more treatment revenue. And in these various cases that I'm talking about, we're able to derive the inputs from administrative database analyses, similar to what I described previously, or just from the peer-reviewed literature. And then we developed also companion models to support payer coverage of this technology too. So you're really meeting the facility's needs, you're meeting the payer's needs, and you're developing that whole package. So again, the outcome in this case is the client was able to use those tools to successfully influence both VACs and payers. So case study number 5, success via case match retrospective study. So what's the situation here? Here we have a surgical supply. It's used in complex cardiac procedures. And the situation that the client is facing is that that surgical supply has a demonstrated ability to improve outcomes and to reduce surgical time. But the issue that they're facing with the VACs is that the supply cost is several $1,000s more than what's currently utilized, and it's not eligible for additional reimbursement outside the standard procedure payment. And so facilities, they're reluctant to do that. They're reluctant to spend several thousand more dollars to use this technology. Okay, yeah, we get it improves outcomes, we get it reduces surgical time, but we're concerned about that expense that we're not being reimbursed for it. So what did we do in this situation? In this case, we decided to utilize the same facilities from the technology's pre-approval pivotal study. So facilities that had had participated in the pivotal study, had treated patients using this technology. It was a prospective case study, so there was no comparator in the pivotal study. But we thought, well, how about if we just create a retrospective comparator? So we designed a case match study to identify, via the facility's EMRs, similar patients who received standard of care treatment. And so once we'd identified those patients and pulled their billing records as well as their outcomes, we were able to determine that the innovative supply and the associated procedure was really associated with lower costs and improved outcomes. And then at that point, it's just a simple budgetary impact model that delivered the results. And so again, the outcome, client is using the tool and continues to use this tool to successfully influence VACs. So what's case study number 6? This is kind of my favorite. It's kind of my favorite because it's so simple. Success via what if. So when have we used this? We've used it multiple times. Maybe it's a preventative care technology, maybe it's a diagnostic technology, something like that. And the technology has a very believable value proposition, but limited data are available regarding the magnitude of that benefit, either in terms of outcomes or cost. So it's one of those that you kind of look at it and you think, well, that's kind of a no-brainer, that it makes sense. It should improve outcomes, it should reduce costs, but the data just wasn't there. So what we suggest doing in a case like that, and see how much mileage you can get out of it, is just to be honest. Talk to the facilities, talk to the different stakeholders on the VACs. You know what? We don't have that hard and fast data at this point. We don't have it at this point. But we'll measure it moving forward. But let's just say right now, what if using our technology resulted in just one fewer adverse event that cost you $30,000 per case? Just suppose that happened. Suppose that's the intended use of the technology. If it just results in one fewer, if our technology just costs $20,000 to implement in those cases, isn't it worth trying it? Give it a shot. So again, what were we trying to do? We were recognizing we don't have a lot of data, but the value proposition was very believable, and just laying it out to them. What do you have to lose if you try this? So what is the outcome? Very frequently in these cases is technology is adopted on a trial basis. The case is proven to the facility then. If it was a no-brainer story, you're going to prove it out. Use continues, and then you gain further data to support your value proposition moving forward. So you could show later on, well, Mission Hospital adopted this technology and it was associated with an X% reduction in hospital-acquired infections, for instance, at an estimated cost savings of Y. So you've used the what if to get your foot in the door with one hospital or multiple hospitals, and then as you get your foot in the door, then you collect the data And so you have further information about what's going on. So what's some feedback that we've had from our clients? So feedback from clients who've been in your shoes is the proof, right, that these tactics work. And so here are just a couple of examples of client feedback. One basically said, the budgetary impact model you developed has been instrumental in turning the tide in our favor in VAC decisions. So that's, that's a big deal. That's really what we're striving for. We want you to be successful. And another client said, essentially, you showed us that we didn't need a large prospective study. They were worried about that. They were worried the only way they were going to gain favor with the VACs was to conduct a large randomized controlled study, given that they'd been getting a lot of pushback. So instead, we were able to analyze their situation and show them smaller evidence sets have been effective in helping us make progress. So we showed them, look, there's a way forward that doesn't require these big studies. We executed that for them. And their feedback was, hey, that's been helpful. It's been effective in helping us make progress with the VACs. And we've gotten our product into these hospitals much faster than we thought we might. So finally, before we go to the Q&A, let's talk through some of the key takeaways that we've uncovered so far. So the first one is really, what works for the VACs works for payers and vice versa. They're not really that different animals anymore. The perspective is different, but the data requirements are really very, very similar. Secondly, while you can't present directly to the VAC, you can arm committee members with evidence. Not features and benefits, but evidence of value. That's really what they're looking for. Choose the easiest path forward. If you have a simple story, tell a simple story. Don't make it complicated if you don't have to. First of all, complicated makes it difficult to understand, makes it less believable. If your story is complex necessarily, then you got to go that route. But if it's not, then don't make things harder than they need to be. How can you generate influential evidence? The case studies that we talked about different ways. Knowing what's important, keeping it simple wherever you can, as we just discussed again. Utilizing administrative database analyses where possible. Utilizing smaller retrospective studies, and then making a what-if argument to gain that pilot usage. But the bottom line really is that every product, every client, every specific situation is different, and it requires careful analysis. And then finally, VACs and payers are your customers. Don't try to get around them. Don't view them as the enemy. Give them what they want and need. And you have a lot of different ways that you can do that. There's not just one method.
So we'd love to take the opportunity now to answer some questions that you might have. I've seen a couple of them come over on the Q&A tab while the webinar was going on, but please submit some others. Would be happy to answer them live with you now. I'll give you a couple minutes. The ones that I've answered, I have gone ahead and published out there under the Q&A tab so that you can take a look at them. And if I don't see any new ones coming in, I do have a couple of questions that were submitted to me prior to the webinar. And so I can kind of walk through those questions and answers for you and give you a little bit of time to enter some other questions if you'd like. So the first question that I had received prior to the webinar was, under what scenarios can a what if or a KISS strategy work? And under what scenarios is really rigorous data required? So the answer to that is really, if it's really simple, if you really have a compelling cost savings story in particular. So your technology is going to come in and it really will save money. It's clear from a back of the envelope kind of analysis that it will save money, even if you don't have a ton of comparative data. If you can make a simple argument that sort of a what if or just a simple pro forma comparison can really work for you. The scenarios where it won't work, is if it's not that clear that you have a cost savings, or that you don't have a cost savings. What you have is an outcomes improvement that maybe could have a cost savings under certain circumstances, or maybe has a longer term cost savings that, again, is of secondary importance to a facility. But, as we move to more of a value-based reimbursement environment, that can become more important to them. In those circumstances where it's just not clear, you really have to go to a more rigorous data capture approach. And that was highlighted in one of the case studies where we talked about conducting the administrative database analysis, where we went out and had to identify, how frequently are these rare complications actually occurring, and how much do they cost, in order to really appropriately value that prophylactic technology that prevented them. So in cases like that, or cases, again, where you have something that's costing the facility more, and maybe they're going to experience a benefit of that in the initial hospitalization, but it's not clear how, that's really when you need to dig in and go through a more rigorous data approach. So again, that's why it's important that we, look at each scenario very carefully and figure out where you land. If we can keep it simple for you, we will keep it simple for you, because again, that's going to be the most compelling, for obvious reasons, to a facility if you can keep it simple, and you're really looking for that trial opportunity with the facility. So second question that I've received, actually have some coming in live now. First one is, how do you think your methods are the same or different for devices that are in a clinical study stage versus a commercialized product? So that's a great question. Our methods are really pretty much the same in a clinical study stage versus the commercialized product. Sometimes in the clinical study stage, when you don't have a lot of definitive data, we're figuring out, what would you have to prove during a clinical study to show a favorable budgetary impact within a hospital, or an appropriate cost effectiveness to a payer. But the techniques are the same. We'll go through the same process with you, understanding what your technology is, who the competitors and the comparators are, what kind of evidence do they have out there for their technology, what will you need to measure in your clinical studies to appropriately compare to them when the time is right. The advantage of doing that initially during the clinical study stage is that we can set up for you, while you're conducting your clinical studies, these are the endpoints that you really need to be sure to include in your clinical studies, so that when you get to launch, you have the right data, and we can really roll into packaging that appropriately for a value analysis committee, or packaging it appropriately for a payer. So it gives you an opportunity to really gain the data before you get to the commercialization phase. So it's always good to start early, but the same process really will apply. So another question that I'm seeing come up is, what have been successes with technologies that don't reduce total episode of care, but are time saving or viewed as soft cost savings? So that's, again, it's a great question. Those are harder stories to tell. I'll just be honest with you. Those are harder stories to tell. So if we're looking at, you're not reducing cost in a total episode of care, what are we doing? And so we kind of have to dig in a little bit more and look at, whose time are you saving? Does that time savings mean something to the facility or to the hospital? Or are they not seeing it as meaningful because, that nurse is employed full-time anyway, and what are they going to do with her if you're saving her time? But if it's in a facility where, they're always there's always stretched, they're always understaffed, they're always running in that scenario, then a time savings to that kind of facility can be meaningful to them. So usually there's some more of that qualitative research piece that we'll want to employ up front to say, okay, what are your target facilities facing? What are the stories that we can tell? And maybe understanding what we might prepare differently for different types of facilities. If it was, say, an academic teaching institution, a cost savings in a certain category of labor might mean more or less than versus a small community hospital. So it really requires typically a broader analysis of what is going to be important and what's going to resonate, or you do run the risk of them saying, well, that doesn't matter to me. So again, it's not as simple a story, but it's something that we can work with, and we have experience doing that. I have another question about, can we follow you on Twitter? No, I'm not on Twitter at the moment. We've just been talking about engaging that social media in internal discussions recently, but I'm not on Twitter currently, but I will certainly let everybody know if we decide to start that. And then, Richard, question is, a catch-22 is that clinical economic value requires usage. Usage is contingent on empirical evidence of clinical economic value. Absolutely, 100%. That is the catch-22 that every manufacturer faces. You go out there and, payers are notorious for this, for saying, well, we don't have evidence of your product in actual use. Well, of course you don't. We just entered the marketplace. And facilities are doing that as well these days. They didn't used to look at it that way, but they are more frequently these days. What we've found that you can do is really present them with the best data that you can at launch. Your best clinical study data that you have prior to entering the marketplace, supplemented with some of the data sources that we've talked about, whether it's electronic medical records showing them what's really happening with the technologies that they're currently using, things they might not be aware of that are costing them money, and then modeling that into your technology as best we can to create a compelling argument. Really what you're after is you're really after getting that hospital to say, okay, we'll give you a trial. We're buying this. We know you don't have enough evidence in actual use. You can't, because you're just entering the marketplace, but we are buying the story that you're telling. We see that it could be of benefit to our facility, so we'll give you a trial. And that's really what you're looking for, because in those trials, you can be collecting the data that will help you moving forward. So that's really, the best that you can do with managing that process. And the other thing that we've learned over the years is, payers and now more frequently facilities will say, well, where are your RCTs? And what we've learned is you don't have to have RCTs, though. If you can show them that you've taken your pivotal clinical study data that maybe was non-comparative and it showed, a clinical and an economic impact at the facilities who participated in your studies. And then you can go back and get those same facilities to mine their electronic medical records, as we talked about in one of the case studies, to find out, okay, well, what happened to, case matched patients who received comparator treatments during that same time frame? What happened to them, looking at outcomes and costs, and really making that kind of a comparison. So you can get smart and be creative with different approaches to study design. And that's something that, we really always try to do. Many of our clients are startup companies, and a lot of them don't have a lot of money. And so we need to be creative with helping them to, begin generating their revenue as they enter the marketplace. And so now, Javier, I've seen your question come in, and I did see that you lost a connection there for a little bit. And so, what did we mean about KISS? So the KISS principle, if you didn't hear it, and I apologize that you lost a connection, the KISS principle really is keep it simple, stupid. Stupid is actually a bad word in my house. We don't allow anybody in our household to say that. So I apologize for saying it in this context. But, really what we're meaning, and I've talked about it several other places in the webinar that I hope you could hear, it's really, if you have a simple story, tell a simple story. Don't overcomplicate things. Don't bring in every variable that you can possibly think of, or that a hospital could possibly think of, because you're going to overwhelm them. They won't have their own data to support all of those variables anyway. And it also tends to make them feel as if you had to throw in everything in the kitchen sink in order to create the story, versus if you have, again, if it's clear the variables and the outcomes that you're impacting and the cost implications of those, focus there and keep it simple. And then allow the hospital to pressure test it with some of their own assumptions, and that can really take you a lot farther. So again, we always try to go simple. We'll make it complicated if we have to tell a complex story, but it's never our preference. Other questions from the folks who are on live? Otherwise, I do have a couple of other questions that were submitted prior to the webinar. So let me go ahead and read through those, giving you a little more time if you have other questions. So the first one, or the second one that was submitted ahead of time, was how do you engage with decision makers on the VAC? If you can't meet with the VAC in person while they're evaluating your technology, how do you get your value proposition to them? Well, you really get your value proposition to them in the same way that you get your other materials to them. You'll hear folks talk about their VAC packs that they're preparing. And just as an aside, if you Google VAC packs, you get some really interesting responses. I did it one time and it was very entertaining for a couple of minutes to follow all of that. But what you can do is, if you have a budgetary impact model, for instance, that you've developed, and even one that can be customized by the facility so they can enter some of their own data, you typically have a salesperson who's doing that with a physician or doing it with somebody in supply management and going through that process. And then, with that tool, you have a takeaway report. So printing out the results, giving that to the stakeholders who are on the VAC, and then that's something that they can then carry forward into that conversation. So there's lots of ways to get that material in. You just can't meet with the VAC live and say, here's the case for our technology. And then the last question that I received prior to the webinar was about, what if your data shows short-term cost increases for longer term cost benefits? Will the facility care, or can you convince them to care? And so again, that's a really good question. As we said, facilities in this reimbursement environment primarily care about the short-term costs. That's their primary perspective, because we still are mostly fee-for-service based. So what the facility does to a patient, that's how they're paid by the payer. So if it's an inpatient hospital procedure, the hospital gets paid according to the DRG that patient maps into. That's the amount of money they get. And so if you can save them money in that hospitalization, that's great, and they like that. If you actually cost them more in that index hospitalization, then it's a harder story to tell. But you can start to bring in things like, what about a 30-day readmission rate where they are penalized if the patients come back to the hospital? Can your technology impact that 30-day window? But even farther out than that, already a lot of hospitals have patients who, and some of them a sizable proportion of their patients, who are in bundled scenarios. So they're already in value-based care scenarios where the hospital and the payer are in an arrangement where caring for that patient is a longer term proposition. The hospital's charged with managing that patient, helping the payer manage that patient over a longer period of time, and reducing costs over 3 months or 6 months or 1 year, depending on the type of value-based arrangement that exists. So you can make that case, and in a tool that's developed for a hospital for a technology in that scenario, we show the short-term cost increases. I mean, you got to own it. Here's where it costs more. Here's your 30-day view. Here's a 6-month view. Here's a 1-year view. Here's a 2-year view. Whatever data you have that can support that, and then talk to them about what percentage of their patients currently are in these value-based arrangements. So where is this impacting them? Where do they think in 3 years they're going to be in terms of their patients and value-based arrangements? So you can make them start thinking about it in a different way, but it is a harder sell for sure. A couple of other questions have come in. You know, have we seen an increasing presence of quality department reps? So somebody from the hospital quality department who's care process, quality, cost improvement focused in VACs. And do they present additional challenges or do they present opportunities? You know, yes, we're seeing more of those folks in VACs from the quality department. We're seeing VACs really expanding their perspectives. So they're not just physicians and nurses and, you know, somebody from purchasing anymore. You really are seeing, you know, the liability department. You're seeing the quality department. You're seeing process improvement. All of those things having a seat at the table, and I always view that as opportunity. And it's just a choice that I make. I think you can see every single person around the table as an additional challenge, which they are when you look at it that way, but they also represent an additional opportunity. So, you know, if your technology really has an impact on, you know, measurement of quality of care within that hospital. So if it's reducing hospital-acquired infections or something like that, or it's reducing readmissions, again, those are places where you can really feature what your technology does in a way that gets the attention of an individual like that who might be on the back. And then last question I'm seeing so far is, you know, how does experience with long-term care and skilled nursing facilities compare with inpatient facilities? They're not quite as far along as the inpatient facilities in terms of the VAC process, but they're getting there. Everybody's getting there. And so certainly the same tenets, if you're applying them on the inpatient side, you're developing your value materials, you're showing budgetary impact, you're showing improvements in population health, you're showing improvements in the patient experience of care, you're showing it over shorter and longer timeframes. Those same tenets are going to be valuable to decision makers in additional facility types, even if they're not as entrenched in the value analysis committee process as some of the inpatient facilities are. Are there other questions at this point? I think I'm fresh out from my perspective if nobody enters another one. All right. Well, if there's no further questions, then I'm kind of going once, going twice. Then we will just go to thank you so much. I really appreciate your time that you spent, you know, listening to the webinar, sitting through the questions and answers. You submitted some great questions. I really appreciate that. Would love for you to reach out to me. My contact information is provided right there. My email address. You can look up a little bit more about our company online as well, and would love to hear back from you. But thank you so much for joining.